You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon, and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Opium's story in China began as a medicine in the 7th century. However, by the 17th century, people started to mix it with tobacco for smoking, which significantly increased its popularity. Going back to the year 1729, China was importing around 200 chests of opium annually, and that was when they first attempted to curb its import with legislation. By the year 1799, when China intensified its efforts to suppress opium, the imports had escalated to 4,500 chests per year, and by 1800, just before the outbreak of the First Opium War, that figure had surged to 40,000 chests. Even after the war concluded with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, the situation did not improve. By 1858, China's imports had reached 70,000 chests each year, which was roughly equivalent to the entire world's opium production in the year 2000. By the late 19th century, China began cultivating opium domestically, reducing its dependence on foreign imports. The 20th century commenced with attempts to eliminate opium cultivation within China, and the British acquiesced to cease their exports to the country in 1907. Nonetheless, following the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911, opium production in China experienced a resurgence. Various regional governments, including the Chinese Communist Party and the British administration in Hong Kong, profited considerably from opium taxation, particularly during the conflict with Japan from 1937 to 1945. Post-1949, with the establishment of the People's Republic of China on the mainland and the Republic of China on Taiwan, both entities claimed they had eradicated the extensive cultivation and consumption of opium. Opium, a powerful substance, made its way to China during the Tang dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907, brought over by Arab merchants. Over time, a Song dynasty poet and medical expert named Su Dongpo noted in his work that opium was being used for its medicinal qualities, saying, "Taoists often persuade you to drink the Gisu water, but even a child can prepare the Yingsu soup." Back then, healers used it to regulate the body's fluids and maintain a person's vital energy. As time went on, during the Ming dynasty from 1368 to 1644, opium gained a reputation as an aphrodisiac, which was thought to boost male performance, fertility, and energy. Xu Boling, a writer from the mid-1400s, detailed its effects in his work Yingzheng Guan. He noted that it was used to treat masculinity, strengthen sperm, and regain vigor, and also claimed it had benefits for alchemists, in sexual context, and for court ladies. He mentioned that regular use could help with chronic diarrhea, which could sap someone's strength, adding that it was as costly as gold at the time. The Ming dynasty's rulers would receive opium as a tribute under the tributary system, during which it was called wuxiang, or black spice. Records from that era tell us that the rulers were once presented with up to 100 kilograms, or 220 pounds of this black spice, in addition to other valuable goods like ivory and peacock feathers from the kingdom of Siam. Later, by 1589, opium was recognized officially as a taxable good. It stayed legal right up until the end of the Ming dynasty in 1637. Back in the 16th century, the Portuguese caught on to how profitable trading opium to China could be. They had factories all over Asia and decided to meet the growing demands in China for both medical and leisure use through the Canton system. Come 1729, China's Yongzheng emperor had seen enough of this new trend of recreational opium smoking and outlawed it. After the British East India Company's victory at the Battle of Buxar in 1764, they started calling the shots in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, taking over taxing and opium trade from the fallen Mughal Empire. The East India Company Act of 1793 made this official. The company was deep in the red, owing £28 million because of the war in India, and they struggled to buy Chinese tea for British consumers since silver was tight. Back home in Britain, the textile industry was booming thanks to the Industrial Revolution. The British East India Company pushed Indian farmers away from cotton, shutting down local weaving, and instead had them grow more and more opium, way more than was needed for medicine. They started auctioning off this opium in Calcutta to make money. Since China didn't allow opium import, the whole business was a bit shady. British merchants would buy tea in Canton, now Guangzhou, on credit and sell opium back in Calcutta to pay off their debts. This opium, stashed away in chests filled with small balls of the drug from the Indian regions of Bengal and Madras, would be smuggled to China's coast and sold off to local merchants there. An 1833 record from the ship Hercules showed different types of opium, like Patna and Malwa, with precise details on quantities and prices for each type. In 1797, the British East India Company cut out the middlemen and dealt directly with opium farmers, further tightening its hold on the trade. Opium exports to China soared from 15 long tons in 1730 to 75 long tons by 1773. China's Jiaqing Emperor banned opium imports in 1799, but Britain kept selling India's opium to China to fix its trade imbalance. By 1804, Britain was profiting, with millions in silver dollars flowing into India. When Americans came into the picture with cheaper Turkish opium around 1810, they snagged a slice of the market. Competition from non-British Indian regions like Malwa brought down prices, but production went up. Then the emperor doubled down. Opium is nothing but trouble, a true poison that wrecks our society and morals. Even though it's illegal, it's becoming a big problem because too many people are using it, and those crafty traders keep selling it for profit. We've tried to control it at the ports, but that's not enough. We need a tough lockdown at all city gates, and the people breaking the law must be caught and punished right there and then. We'll make sure the supply is cut off from Guangdong and Fujian, places it's coming from. But these efforts barely made a dent. By the Qianlong reign, opium was the in thing among scholars and officials, and by the 1830s, city folk were heavily into it. A society that had shifted to embrace commercialization and consumerism saw opium as a hip, sophisticated leisure activity, a badge of wealth and refined taste. But the government in Beijing was far removed and couldn't stop the smuggling in the south. A leaky border and high local demand didn't help. By 1838, the number of Chinese hooked on British opium was in the millions. It was the go-to painkiller before aspirin existed. Addicts made for poor workers, and their silver was disappearing overseas. Opium initially might have been a fun pastime, but quitting meant going through hell. Chills, nausea, cramps, and sometimes even death from withdrawal. Once hooked, folks would do anything for their fix. Seeing all this unfold, Emperor Daoguang knew he had to crack down. Court was split between those who wanted to legalize and tax opium and those who wanted to stamp it out. In the end, the suppress it crew won, and Lin Zexu was sent to Canton with orders to clean house. He arrested Chinese dealers and told foreigners to hand over their opium without payment. When they said no, he blockaded their quarters, ultimately pressuring them to give in. Lin destroyed a massive stash of opium, 1,000 long tons of it over 23 days. China made a tough move against opium use, which created a conflict with Britain. The British, significant supporters of free trade, were in fact supplying China with opium through their merchants. After a Chinese official named Commissioner Lin destroyed a large stash of opium, the British traders wanted their government back home to compensate them. This caused considerable tension, as China was already struggling with the high demand for opium that was available in limited supply. The British government, on the other hand, believed that China should be responsible for the reimbursement. To enforce their point, they deployed military forces from India and succeeded in defeating the Chinese army and navy in several encounters. These victories compelled China to negotiate terms. The 1842 Treaty of Nanking accomplished quite a lot. It opened China up for further opium trading, ceded Hong Kong to Britain, established low tariffs over which China had little influence, granted Britain the most favored nation status, and permitted Britain to station diplomats in China. Additionally, a crucial aspect of the treaty, under Article 5, required China to pay $3 million for the debts that Canton's Hong merchants owed the British due to the destroyed opium. The trade of opium was often discussed in conjunction with the trade of Huli labor. English-speaking businessmen colloquially labeled these trades as poison and pig. Let's explore the trade dynamics between Britain and China in the mid-19th century. After the Treaty of Nanking opened up new ports, Britain's purchases from China had grown to be 9 times what they sold to China by 1854. The cost of managing the growing territories of Hong Kong, Singapore, and India was putting a strain on the British Empire's finances. It was the sales of Indian opium that helped to offset this financial imbalance. There were mounting grievances about how British merchants were treated in Chinese ports, and China's reluctance to welcome more foreign diplomats. Then, a seemingly small event occurred that Britain used as a justification to push for an expanded opium trade in China. This event involved the Arrow, a trading ship with an out-of-date British registration. The Qing government seized it, accusing it of smuggling salt. The British claimed this was a violation of Article 9 of the 1843 Treaty of the Bogue, which covered extraterritorial right. Tensions quickly surged, sparking the Second Opium War, or the Arrow War. in 1856. This conflict saw various skirmishes before finally concluding with the signing of the Treaty of Tientsin in 1860. While this treaty didn't explicitly make opium trade legal, it did open 5 more Chinese ports and allowed for the first time foreign merchants to trade deep into the inland areas of China, well away from the coast. After making deals with the British, similar treaties were also made with the United States and France. These treaties came to be known as the unequal treaties. Chinese historians view the Opium Wars as the beginning of what is referred to as China's century of humiliation. William Ewart Gladstone, who later became the British Prime Minister, was strongly against the opium trade. As a member of Parliament, he denounced the trade, especially between China and British India, calling it most infamous and atrocious. Gladstone was a vocal critic of the Opium Wars, denouncing the British role in the opium trade with China. He attributed the conflict to the policies of Palmerston, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, and he expressed his concerns in May 1840, stating he feared the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China. He condemned the war as being a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace. Gladstone's opposition to opium was also driven by personal reasons. The trade had a profound effect on his sister Helen. This personal connection, along with the war starting under Palmerston's administration, made Gladstone initially reluctant to join the government of Prime Minister Peel prior to 1841. After the chaos of the mid-19th century's Taiping Rebellion subsided, opium became a vital part of the economy. Traders used it like cash since it was lighter than copper and accepted everywhere, particularly in inner provinces such as Sichuan and Yunnan. Poppies, which grow in various conditions, became widespread, making it easier for local officials to collect taxes even where other crops failed. Even though the government demanded opium suppression, many officials just pretended to enforce the rules. Some did it to avoid upsetting the farmers who relied on growing poppy, a very profitable plant, and others did so due to corruption. One official pointed out how people would remove a few poppy plants and lay them by the road whenever inspectors visited to seem like they were cooperating. A provincial governor commented that opium had gone from being seen as a dangerous drug to being as commonplace as tea or rice. According to the historian Jonathan Spence, by the 1800s, opium had infiltrated every level of society in the Qing dynasty, from the cosmopolitan city dwellers to the rural countryside, and from the rich to the working class. By the 1880s, even officials who had fought against opium smoking and growing now relied on the tax revenue it generated. As the Qing dynasty was coming to an end, there was a pushback against opium, fueled by moral outrage. When new government campaigns to suppress opium started post-1901, the resistance didn't come from the British, who were already losing out to China's own opium production, but from Chinese farmers, wholesalers, retailers, and users, many from influential backgrounds, who depended on the opium trade for their income. Despite these conflicts, the Qing government kept up its efforts, collaborating with global anti-narcotic groups. Yet, even with the imposition of new import duties by the 1902 Mackay Treaty, Indian opium kept its special tax status at 110 taels per chest, as the treaty acknowledged China's right to tax its own opium. The International Opium Commission noted that while many saw opium smoking as trendy or even classy, particularly among the youth, there was also widespread condemnation of the practice. It was commonly found among various segments of society such as students, soldiers, the urban middle class, and richer peasants. The sex industry in particular combined opium use with its services, making it a popular leisure activity. In response to the issues surrounding opium, Great Britain agreed in 1907 to slowly stop exporting opium to China over 10 years, and China pledged to end domestic production in the same time frame. Production numbers show a dramatic decrease from 35,000 metric tons in 1906 to just 4,000 metric tons by 1911. Efforts from inside and outside the country had been making headway, but when the Qing government collapsed in 1911, the campaign against opium crumbled too. Local and provincial authorities in China soon returned to selling opium for money. Without the Qing government, foreign nations stopped their attempts to end the opium trade. In China's northern regions, Ningxia and Suiyuan, General Ma Fuxiang, Chinese Muslim, had a complicated relationship with opium. Although General Ma banned opium and made it illegal because Chinese Muslims were typically against opium smoking, the tables turned when his policies were overturned. By 1933, social classes across the board were using opium, and Ningxia suffered economically. In 1923, it was discovered by an official from the Bank of China in Baotou that General Ma was actually involved in the opium trade to fund his military, making $2 million from it that year. He even used the government's bank to manage the transportation of silver to finance this trade. During the Nanjing Decade, from 1928 to 1937, under General Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist government had a complicated stance on opium. Chiang himself did not agree with opium use ethically, but it was seen by other officials as a potential revenue source. The government moved from trying to reform people's behavior to becoming more lenient by increasing opium prices, which did put some users off. But the approach wasn't consistent. Some repeat offenders were even executed. Chiang enlisted the help of Du Yesheng, a mob boss, to lead the Shanghai Opium Suppression Bureau. As one American diplomat noted, the supposed crackdown on opium seemed more like a strategy to bring more business to the government's own opium trade. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Communist Party farmed and taxed opium in the Shanxi-Gansu-Ningxia border region. This practice became a significant part of their income. By 1945, opium taxes made up over 40% of their revenue. Jonathan Marshall explains that the city of Chongqing also saw opium as a crucial item, allowing for trade between areas under the Chinese Nationalist Party and Japanese control. To get the funds they needed, they even allowed Du Yesheng, with his many connections in Japanese territories, to oversee opium smuggling operations, which were monitored by the government's Anti-Smuggling Bureau. The government led by Mao Zedong is widely recognized for eliminating the use and production of opium in the 1950s. They accomplished this through strict punishment and by changing society. Approximately 10 million people addicted to opium were put into mandatory treatment programs, while those selling the drug faced the death penalty. Additionally, areas that once grew opium were turned over to new crops. After these efforts, the remaining opium production moved to the Golden Triangle, which is just south of China's border. This region mainly supplied opium to Southeast Asia, but also to American soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War. In fact, at the height of the issue in 1971, about 20% of the soldiers believed they were addicted to the drug. By 2003, it was estimated that China had 4 million people who regularly use drugs and 1 million who were officially recognized as drug addicts. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.